Greetings, greetings to Brother Sonnetter and the House of Consciousness. Today we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Karl Baughman of Prairie View A&M University of Prairie View, Texas. And we are broadcasting from Houston, and I'm glad to be here with each and every one of you. And today or tonight's topic, whatever time that you are viewing this video, will be on the historicity, the historicity, the historicity of Jesus. And Dr. Karl Baughman of Prairie View A&M University is going to share his knowledge and his expertise and his credentials on this subject. So greetings, Dr. Karl Baughman. How are you today?
I'm good. How about you?
Oh, my goodness. I'm doing fine. And I am so just honored that you would find time to do this on our behalf. So again, dear sir, I thank you tremendously, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity. You and I haven't met, personally as of yet, and we're meeting here for the first time via video. But I am indeed looking forward to visiting my alma mater, which is Prairie View A&M University, and you and I sitting down maybe for lunch or something like that, and chopping it up, you know. And so again, sir, thank you for being here. And my first question to you, and again, is on regarding the historicity of Jesus. It seems like that this has been an ongoing uh, uh, debate or an ongoing issue for as long as I've been alive, you know. And I'm hoping that, and I do believe that you will be able to shed some light on this issue regarding the historicity of Jesus, the science of the historicity of Jesus, with your expertise. And if you don't mind, sir, if you would feel free to go right ahead and to give us a little bit about your background and about your history and teachings and lectures on the historicity of Jesus.
All right. Well, I'm Karl Baughman, and I'm currently an ancient history professor at Prairie View A&M. I received my PhD in ancient history from Western Michigan University. My field particularly is Roman Empire and early Christianity, especially the connection between them, the relationship. I've written a few articles on the relationship between Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries and the Roman Empire. And I teach the early Christianity class. I just actually taught it this past semester, alongside, just general histories also on the Roman Empire and Western civilization. I've been doing this. I've been at Prairie View for about 2 years, but I've been teaching on early Christianity for probably about 10 years. And I wanted to make a comment. You mentioned a long debate, and it is probably mostly your lifetime, because it wasn't really until maybe the 80s or 90s that we started getting a lot of what we call the Jesus myth, which is this idea that Jesus was never a historical person. We don't get that argument before the past few decades. And so it is a pretty recent debate, a pretty recent argument, and it's certainly not a widely held argument. And so hopefully I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But
all righty, sir. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. So we're going to go right into it. The question is today, and hopefully you can shed some light on this issue. Is Jesus a historical person? Again, one more time. Is Jesus a historical person? And can the science, the historical science of historicity, prove and affirm that Jesus is, again, a real figure in history. So Dr. Karl Baughman, go right ahead there, sir, and you have the floor to share your information.
All right. Yes, we have, I believe, enough evidence, not just from Christian sources, but from non-Christian sources that give us enough evidence that Jesus of Nazareth was a person who lived in the first century in Judea, in the Roman Empire. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those sources. There have been a few books written recently, mostly in the 90s. Dan Barker, Losing Faith in Faith, and Earl Doherty, The Jesus Puzzle. They make the argument that Jesus was not a real person, that he was in fact a myth. Even Bart Ehrman, who is a textual critic of the Bible, he is also a self-professed agnostic atheist. He believes Jesus was a real person. And that's because he's being a good historian. Because in order to hold to this myth that Jesus was not a real person, you have to throw out a lot of evidence. And when we, as historians, when we look at evidence, when we look at particularly ancient evidence, we need to make sure that we're holding all historical documents to the same criteria. So when we look at, say, the Bible, or we look at Tacitus, who's a Roman historian in the first century, or we look at Suetonius, who's writing in the early second century, or we look at Herodotus, who's writing in the 6th century or 5th century BC. We ask ourselves questions, and we make sure that these evidences sort of match up to the same sort of criteria. Things like, for example, if you've got multiple sources talking about the same thing, for example, the Gospels all talking about Jesus, are they giving us the same basic story? Even if some details are slightly wrong, that can be a good thing, because for one, it tells us they're not copying off each other. And so the reliability increases. In addition to sort of telling the same story, for example, the fire of Rome. The fire of Rome, in the year 64, the city of Rome burns. And we're not sure how much of the city burns, because we have one source that tells us that 2/3 of the city is burned. Another source that tells us all but 4 districts of the 14 districts are completely destroyed. We have another one that tells us it's not so bad. And we look at those and we say, okay, we might not know exactly how much of the city was burned, but we do know there's a fire. And so when we do the same thing when we look at the life of Jesus, you don't have to believe he performed miracles, but there is enough evidence that tells us he was a real person. Whether or not you believe that person is the Son of God is a different argument. It's a different conversation. And so we've got this, what we might call this criterion of multiple attestations. Are there multiple sources talking about something, and do they generally agree? We've got sources about, just cultural environment. Does the story fit what we know about the historical environment? When we read about Jesus, does it make sense that he's a Jew living in the 1st century Roman Empire? Yes. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. Does it match up with language and linguistics? Is the Greek that people write about Jesus in the 1st century, is it what we call Koine Greek, which is the Greek of the time period? It means common Greek. Yes. And so are these things matching up when we look at this life of Jesus? And of course, when we look at Jesus, because of his importance to Christianity, also his importance to Judaism and Islam, we get a lot more people who argue about it. And that's because of this sort of religious side to who Jesus was. And so we've got biblical sources, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And, you don't have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God to recognize that the Gospels provide us with historical detail. They provide us with a 1st century historical context to Jews living in the Roman Empire. And we see that in how Jesus is portrayed. And some sources, like, for example, Dan Barker, in his Losing Faith in Faith, says that because the Gospels are religious texts, they are therefore biased and therefore not reliable in talking about Jesus. Well, as historians, we would say bias need not connote falsehood. For example, John Adams, one of the U.S. founding fathers, writes a history of the American Revolution. He's obviously biased. He's one of our founding fathers, so he's on our side. Do we discount his history because of it? Josephus, someone whom we're going to talk about in just a second, a Jewish historian during the Jewish rebellion. He gives us the best account of the Jewish rebellion of 66. We don't dismiss it, and yet it's obviously biased. He was a Jew fighting for the Jewish rebellion. Then he switches sides for the Romans. And so, there's a lot of bias in what he does. And so it's important for us as historians to recognize that just because someone's biased doesn't mean we have to discount their accounts. We should be careful about dismissing evidence without real good cause as historians, particularly in the ancient period, because we don't have a lot of evidence in the ancient period just because of time. And through time, we lose documents, we lose archaeological things. And so it's important for us to make sure before we dismiss something that it really is unreliable. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the Gospels because, your audience may already be familiar with them, but also if we're going to look at Jesus as a historical person, I think it's also important for us to look at extra biblical sources, things that aren't part of the Bible. We have some pretty good sources from the Romans, and we've got some sources from the Jews. I mentioned already Josephus, who is a historian, a Jewish historian living in the Roman Empire. He is a commander of Jewish forces at Jotapata when the rebellion breaks out in 66. He is then later captured by the Romans. He will then switch sides and become a very prominent Jewish historian, kind of taken care of by the next emperor, Vespasian. And he writes a history of the Jews that we call Antiquities. And what he does is he looks at the history of the Jews from the first day of creation all the way through his present day. So it's a pretty massive volume of history. And in that, of course, he talks about Jesus. I'm going to bring up my screen because I want to show you a quote from Josephus. Josephus is he writes his history about the year 94. And so when the war's over, he's living in Rome at the time. And he writes this history of Antiquities. And he mentions a guy called Jesus. Jesus is a pretty common name in the first century, as is Mary. Little trivia, Mary is about 25% of all women in first century Judea are named Mary. Jesus is also a very prominent name. And so when Josephus talks about Jesus, I think there are 27 Jesuses in his history. When he talks about Jesus, he always makes sure that you know which Jesus he's talking about. And in book 18, beginning chapter 63, he tells us, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate, the Roman governor, condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. And so here we're getting Josephus talking about this guy named Jesus, whom he says is perhaps the Messiah. Josephus, as far as we know, does not believe Jesus is the Messiah. He doesn't believe Jesus is the Son of God. He doesn't believe Jesus is the same guy that Christians see him as. He's a traditional first century Jew. And in this passage, Josephus gives us a few clues as to what he thinks. He's not a fan of him being the Messiah. He says people are saying he's doing things. He recognizes that this guy named Jesus has been executed by Pontius Pilate. And then he mentions that his disciples say that he rose from the dead? Josephus probably doesn't believe he has. But he does know that Jesus of Nazareth was a real person living in first century Judea, and he makes a reference of it here. He's not a Christian, and so this would be a great opportunity for Josephus to say, oh, and this guy never existed, if he had not existed. He also mentions Jesus a couple books later. In book 20, in chapter 200, he's talking about a guy named James, who is the Christian bishop of Jerusalem at the time. And he says, and so he, Annas, who is one of the chief priests, convened the judges of the Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish court, and brought before them a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. Christ is just the Greek word for Messiah, and certain others. He accused them of having transgressed the law and delivered them up to be stoned. And so here's a reference to Jesus's brother, James. And this is important because what it shows us is that just like when Josephus is talking about Jesus, the man, now he's talking about James. And because Jesus is already well known, he connects James to Jesus. Just like, when you talk about, if you wanted to talk about Sasha let's say President Obama's daughters, you're going to talk about them, but then you're going to mention daughters of President Obama. Why? Well, because you know who President Obama is, and you might know his daughters, but more people in the world are going to know who the president was than his children. And so more people are going to know who this Jesus is, who these Christians are, talking about. And so if Jesus was not a real person, first off, then why talk about his brother? Why bring up Jesus' name? Why connect him to Jesus? It doesn't make sense for a man who was alive in the first century to not immediately point out that Jesus was not a real person. And so this is a good evidence for that from a Jewish source, Josephus, who is not Christian. Another non-Christian source we have is a man named Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian who writes in the first century up into the early second century. He is the most meticulous of the Roman historians, so much so that we don't have all of his history still today because he wrote too much, too much for medieval historians to continue copying. Because in the Middle Ages, you had to copy everything by hand. And Tacitus writes so much that it becomes too much to copy. And so we do have some, though, and one of them is called the Annals. Annals coming from the Latin word meaning the years. And it's so detailed to the point of boredom because Tacitus essentially goes, all right, and in this year, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. The most boring way you can do history. But it's so detailed that we get a lot of really juicy nuggets. And I'm going to share my screen again. Tacitus is going to talk about the fire of Rome that we mentioned in 64. And he mentions in this passage we're going to see, he said, the fire breaks out and people start blaming the emperor. Just like in grade school, when you learn about the Great Depression, we've got all these causes for the Great Depression. And yet, if you wanted to pinpoint what's the reason for the Great Depression, easy, President Hoover. You always blame the guy at the top. The economy's good, you say it's the market. When the economy's bad, you blame the president. The same is true for the Romans. And so when something goes bad, you blame the emperor. And Tacitus tells us in book 15 of his Annals, consequently, to get rid of the report, namely the fact that Nero's being blamed, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, which would be the Latin form of Christ. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, governors, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So here's Tacitus, who gives us, by the way, the earliest evidence that we have outside of the Bible. that Jesus is crucified by Pontius Pilate. Here he says extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius under Pontius Pilate. Non-citizens would have been crucified, and so when you talk about the extreme penalty, the death penalty for non-citizens is crucifixion. And so here we've got this oldest reference to this guy named Jesus, and if he didn't exist, why connect him to these known historical figures, the Emperor Tiberius and the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate? And so here we've got Tacitus, not a fan of Christians at all. And you see this last line here, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. What Tacitus is doing is Tacitus, very much like modern Americans, talks about Rome much like we might talk about Washington, D.C. A cesspool where all the terrible people go to congregate. We call them congressmen. We talk bad about our politicians. Romans did the same thing. Tacitus talks down about his politicians. He refers to Rome as this place where, kind of all the big fads are. And everything, all these superstitions become popular. And he points out Christianity. Christianity, which we know, by the way, arrived in Rome probably in the early 50s, perhaps sooner. There's a large Jewish population in Rome, and so Christianity would have spread rather quickly. And it's a large enough group that they could be singled out. And so Christianity has grown in Rome rather rapidly. We're dealing with maybe about just a couple decades after the crucifixion of Jesus. And so it's a pretty rapid, Paul writes his letters to Rome in about 54 or so, and there's already a Christian community there. Well, Tacitus, who refers to Christianity as a disease in other parts of his text, should be quick to point out Jesus was not a real person. But instead, he mentions that he's crucified under a Roman governor during the reign of a Roman emperor. And that's important because what it demonstrates is that Tacitus doesn't doubt that Jesus was a real person. What he does doubt is the fact that he thinks it's a superstition. He's obviously much more in tune with the Roman religions. He believes that Christianity and Judaism, which also he talks bad about, are garbage. And so if he wants to drive that point home and Jesus isn't real, why does he not bring it up here? Because that would seem to be the most logical thing to do, and he doesn't, which gives us this indication. When we look at this as ancient historians, we say, why would Tacitus say that Jesus is real, even though he doesn't like him, unless he's real? And we might call that, sort of a criterion of embarrassment, where you have to give sort of positive testimony is in an otherwise hostile source. In law, that would be, evidence against your own interest. And so we've got Tacitus not attempting to hide the fact Jesus was real, but rather just sort of poo-pooing the Christian faith. We see another example of that in Suetonius. Suetonius writes a little bit later than Tacitus, but Suetonius is one of the most popular historians for the Middle Ages. His text, which we call the 12 Caesars, he does a biography of 12 different Roman emperors, is the second most copied document in the Middle Ages. The first, of course, being the Bible. Suetonius is the second because his stories of the emperors are so fascinating because they're filled with violence and sex. And so people in the Middle Ages, just like people today, like to watch, people get hurt and people have sex. And so we've got lots of copies of this. And even when you look in these manuscripts, just a little side note, you see food crumbs sometimes in the binding. And that's because monks would eat while they looked over these books and read them, much like we sit in front of the television and eat, stuff our face and watch, sex and violence on TV. Here, these monks who are supposed to be good Christian monks are busy watching, essentially, these stories while they eat. And so we get a lot of copied from Suetonius. And he gives us, I'm going to share my screen again and show you a couple slides. Just one slide. We've got a couple quotes from Suetonius. And he's writing about in the 120s, early 120s. The first one comes from his biography of Nero. And he was talking about the fire of Rome, just like Tacitus had described. Except Tacitus takes this way of saying, Nero's blamed, but, he's a politician, so of course he's blamed. Suetonius is like, oh, Nero totally did. So Suetonius, not a fan of Nero, not a fan of a lot of politicians. And he says, talk about Nero, he says, he likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, a sort of people who held a new and impious superstition. And so when we're introduced to Christianity in Suetonius, he's introducing them as this sort of new and impious superstition, and essentially an evil group of people from Suetonius's point of view. And so we get a bias, obviously, from Suetonius of being sort of this anti-Christian sort of mentality. And then in his book on Claudius, he's talking about this incident in which the emperor sort of cracks down on the Jews. This happened quite often. The Jews made up a very large percentage of the population in the city of Rome. And sometimes if there was a disagreement, one way to sort of handle minority populations in the Roman Empire was that you found their leaders and you booted them out of the city. This happens during the reign of Claudius, who is emperor in the 50s. And while he's emperor, there is an incident that Suetonius describes, and he says, he, referring to Claudius, banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. Now, Chrestus, when we look at Latin, the E and the I are often interchangeable. We see this in the modern language of French, because in French today, the word for Christian, okay, I got rid of the screen. Okay. The word for Christian in French is chrétien, not chrétien. And that's because in Latin, you can switch the E and the I oftentimes. But you can also switch C's and G's. And that's just because of the way the Latin alphabet works. And so when we see Chrestus, it's an alternate spelling for Christus, which of course is the Latin for Christ. And he says that there is an incident between them. And so probably some kind of debate between the Christians and the Jews, who are seen as being part of the same group. Christians are seen as just a sect of Judaism at this time. And we see evidence of this in Paul's letters and in the book of Acts, because we're going to see Priscilla and Aquila, who will show up in Corinth. Why? Because Claudius has sort of booted out what he sees as these troublemakers. And so here we've got another source, Suetonius. Obviously not a fan. He calls them a mischievous religious belief, superstition, and yet he doesn't attempt to say, oh, and the guy that they claim rose from the dead never existed. That's because Suetonius knows that Jesus did exist, was executed by Pontius Pilate, as did Tacitus. Even though they're not fans of Christians, they recognize their historical connection. Now, we have other evidence as well. I think these are some of the really poignant ones that are probably the easiest ones to sort of pinpoint sort of Jesus outside of the New Testament, outside Christian sources. I didn't bring in any Christian sources. And I think it's important for us to remember that when we look at these sources as historians, you can, not believe a particular religious thing, but still recognize the historical elements of it. You don't have to be a Muslim to believe that Muhammad was a real person. We know he was. Lived in the 7th century in Arabia. You don't have to be a Buddhist to believe that, the first Buddha was a real person. You don't have to be a Christian to believe that Jesus was a real person. The debate about Jesus shouldn't be whether or not he was a man. The debate is whether or not you believe Jesus is the Son of God. And that's a completely different discussion. And it's a discussion that you're not going to be using historical documents to talk about, because, when it's a matter of faith. And the sort of irony is I think it takes more faith to believe that Jesus was a myth than it takes to believe Jesus is the Son of God. Because as a historian, you have to ignore so much evidence to say Jesus wasn't a real person. And a good historian can't do that. And so you can, Bart Ehrman, who is an avowed agnostic, knows Jesus was a real person. Does he believe Jesus is the Son of God? No. But that doesn't matter, because that's not the discussion. And so when we deal with this issue of historicity, we hold Jesus and the Gospels and sources about Jesus to the same standards we hold other documents. We know Herodotus was a real person living in the 5th century BC, even though we have more information on Jesus than we do Herodotus. But we don't doubt the historicity of Herodotus. And to doubt the historicity of Jesus is more of a conscious effort to ignore history for, whether it be political or religious reasons. But it's just not very sound history. And I have not met an actual historian who would argue otherwise. And so I think, and so those are just a few examples. If we have more time, we can have a lot more examples. When I teach this class, we talk about different examples, and it takes us a little over an hour. And so we don't have that kind of time today. But
well, Dr. Karl, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
That was absolutely awesome, sir. Absolutely informative and absolutely definitive. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, dear sir, for sharing and being with us on today. And as I stated previously, I am definitely looking forward to meeting you in person. At this time, if you have any upcoming speaking engagements or any books, I think you see we're working on a book. And if you want to share any information on how the worldwide audience can contact you, you're welcome to do that and to promote anything that's going on or coming up in your profession and in your life. Please take time to do that now, sir.
Well, thanks. But I mean, if anyone wants to get a hold of me, or if you got questions, or if you'd like, me to speak at something or chat about something, we can share my email. I guess I don't know if you can share that on your YouTube site, or it's just KEBAUGHMAN@pvaamu.edu.
Okay. And yes, I will be sharing that. If you'll just mention that 2 more times, maybe someone might be writing this down, and your email address. So go right ahead and do that.
My email is KEBAUGHMAN@pvaamu.edu.
Excellent. Excellent.
KEBAUGHMAN@pvaamu.edu.
Excellent, sir. Thank you very much. And again, I appreciate you affording us this time, and am looking forward to our upcoming personal visit sometime in the very near future. And thank you, thank you, thank you. Are there any final remarks that you would like to give us before we end this interview?
Just thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Indeed, man. Thank you very much. Well, sir, I appreciate you, and I'll be talking with you immediately at the end of this broadcast, which I'm about to end right now. So again, thank you, Brother Sarnetter and the House of Consciousness family. Peace.